Hello, it's good to be with you. So I do apologize that this is coming to you from a rather unconventional location because we should be recording this in the classroom, in the upper story of the two-story building, which is where I would invite you to come and join us week in and week out as we continue this study. But the reason why it's coming to you from my office at home, and I also ask you to forgive the humming noise in the background. That's my air conditioning unit just a few feet behind me. So we'll have to bear with that a couple more times over the period of the next hour and a half as we're going through this, but I don't think it interrupts the audio quality too much. Nobody's complained about it with the Sunday school lessons that I record in here. So having said that, this was, thank you, part and parcel, my fault, as goes why we're recording this here, and that's because I failed to actually start the recording to capture our in-studio session on Wednesday night, so I will have other eyes helping me with that in the future to make sure we can avoid that snafu. So just a few house cleaning or keeping rules as we move forward. I just want to explain what I mean when I use the term intensive. So if you've ever went through an Old Testament or New Testament survey, you recognize that you are getting a very brief overview of those books following some sort of generic outlined structure that gives you just a few key themes and highlights of the book before you have to move on to keep pace with whatever time limit's been set in place. We are going to be going much deeper than just a survey. However, this is not a verse-by-verse expositional study, which would take years for us to go through. And we're going to wrap this whole thing up in 26 weeks. So I am not condensing down the material of every chapter to tell you these are the cliff notes or takeaways, and everything else you can feel safe to kind of discard. It's rather inconsequential. Not at all. If anything, it's just putting some interpretive guideposts in place such that as you see a few things in each of these chapters that may not be so readily apparent, that may take a few more years of scholarly digging and so forth to see, as goes design patterns and major themes and allusions to other parts of scripture that the author of the book really wants us to pay attention to, that would have been easier for ancient audiences to capture, but we in our time might not again readily capture so easily. We need to look at those things as lenses to help us appreciate the rest of the content of these chapters, which is what I hope to help you see. So with that, the idea is that you'll continue to read and work through mining the content of all the rest of these chapters to get as much as you can out of it, but using this material as an adjunct to that to help you better understand what it is that sits before you. Because I can certainly appreciate that the words of Isaiah in many places can be rather confusing or daunting to try to interpret. Also, we won't be covering 4 chapters every week. I'm only including chapter 4 in this because it's, I think, 6 verses. So the idea is the pacing is going to be between 2 and 3 chapters every week. But when I have the chance to get small chapters in there, I will try to, if it's conducive to what we're following or studying for that week. And that will allow us the freedom in certain weeks to be able to do just maybe 2 chapters where we have anywhere from 40 to 50 verses per chapter. So we don't feel so rushed there, just to kind of give you a purview of what to expect. Also, I'm not going to spend an entire lesson doing an introduction to the book, as goes talking about the time frame it's written and whatnot. I will allude to that briefly in the little bit of introduction I'll give, but not going to talk much about the themes of the book and those kinds of things that you might find as part of the material as an introduction to this book in your study Bible or some other resource that you might use as a commentative work. I would adjure you to go to those scholarly sources to look at those thoughts that they might have to give, and I can recommend several sources if you're curious as to where to go. But having said that, I will give us this by way of an introduction because I think it's very important for us to appreciate what's actually going on in the background with respect to the historical framework of the time that Isaiah is working within, okay? And of course provides us the motivation behind and the thrust behind why Isaiah is preaching the messages that he is and the significance that it has spiritually for the people of Judah, largely, as he mostly prophesies to just that kingdom. But of course, Israel as a whole, for anyone else who may have the chance to have privy access to what it is that he is saying. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the times of these kings. I'm sorry for that popping up on the screen. And I've got several verses or passages of scripture here included on the screen for you. I just want you to understand I'm not going to read all of those. I'll let you allude to those yourself, but I will bring a few things from each of those passages and try to recall as I'm doing that, so you'll know where they came from if you're taking notes. Now, one more thing. When we look at the very first verse of chapter 1 of the book of Isaiah, this is what we are told. These are the visions concerning Judah and Jerusalem that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw during the reigns of the kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, which spans a time period roughly between 792 and 686 BC. Obviously, Isaiah did not prophesy or live for that entire time period. When we come at it from the perspective of Isaiah 6, which is the information given to us concerning his call and commission as a prophet, that comes at the time of King Uzziah's death. So he starts his tenure as a prophet pretty close to the end of Uzziah's reign as king. But of course, he will prophesy for the entire tenures of Jotham's and Ahaz's reign as kings, and probably for most of Hezekiah's time as king, but certainly not all. And he will wind up passing away before Hezekiah passes the crown off to his son, Manasseh. All right. One more thing with respect to that, I would also say that, number one, it's not unique for multiple prophets to be prophesying and ministering through the kingdom or land of Israel, because, of course, while Israel's occupying the land, it's not always a kingdom. Some of these prophets are nameless. They're just simply referred to as man of God or prophet or seer or whatever the case might be. Many of them, before the days of Isaiah, are not what we will call writing prophets. We have preserved for us in historical reference works such as Kings what these prophets were saying, largely Elijah and Elisha. But these, what we will call now writing prophets, will come after the time of the dividing of the kingdom into these two distinct kingdoms of Israel and Judah. But again, it's not unique for multiple prophets to be ministering at any given time. But what is unique for us is that we have this many writing prophets that are working at the same time, whose oracles also begin with this very same formula. And I'm speaking of the men Amos, Micah, and Hosea. Their oracles, and I'll use that word a lot. And what I mean by that is just the totality of their scroll or messages within that work that is a singular unit, as goes a particular message or a vision. Okay. So anyway, their oracles, and those three prophets are contained in the scroll of the 12 or the minor prophets, all start with the exact same phrase, the vision concerning whatever, because it might not be distinctly Judah, but this will be given to whichever prophet is named as the person that this work is attributed to, that happened during the reigns of these kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, which, when you add this all together, it's not merely just meant to historically situate for us when these prophets ministered, but also to help us understand that there is something going on here, that God would raise up this many contemporary prophets who will also have their words preserved for posterity's sake, that we must look at and appreciate how Israel's history and story is transitioning from the previous periods of a united monarchy unto a divided monarchy, and then the periods of previous prophets such as Elijah and Elisha, to the tenures of these prophets and what God is speaking through them as goes judgment and hope for the future in the time of Messiah. Because one thing that certainly seems to be a common thread between all of these prophets is that no longer are they voices that are attempting to try to turn Israel back, but they are prophesying of what seems to be inescapable pending judgment and doom for Israel, but following that up with the hope of the period of Messiah, when a new king or prince, depending upon who you're reading, who is like a new David figure, will come on the scene to lead Israel into this new era, right? So anyway, let's look at the times of these kings. When we start with Uzziah, during his time as king, very little is given to us by way of the writer of Kings, but the writer of Chronicles has a few chapters to dedicate to Uzziah's reign as king, which does a lot to embellish upon why it was so significant that when it is said in Isaiah 6 that in the year that King Uzziah died, there's a lot of uncertainty and vulnerability within the kingdom of Judah itself, because Uzziah is accorded as being one of Judah's greatest kings following on after David. Part of the reason would be from 2 Chronicles 26, verses 6 through 15. To name some of the feats he accomplished, he lays siege to and pulls the walls down of Gat and Ashdod, which are two of the 5 capital cities in the Philistine kingdom. So to go into their land, battle them, pull down the walls of these capital cities would speak highly of the fact that Uzziah was a David-like conquering king, because David, following on after the likes of Samson and Saul, and of course we have to fit Samuel in there too, because he did something to help kind of subdue the Philistines and keep them in check. But many of these key figures were battling against the Philistines, but could never really get them out of the land of Israel till David comes along. And then he does much to subdue and virtually render the Philistines inert, assigning them to a position of being a non-threat for the rest of his time as king and throughout all of Solomon's tenure as king. But after the dividing of the kingdom, then Philistia will start to encroach on the eastern border that they share with Judah into the land and start to recolonize some territory, until Uzziah comes along. And not only does he wind up pushing them all out, but then he works to colonize some of their areas as well, and subduing them and keeping them under boot, much in the way that David did. And so beyond that, we see that he receives tribute from the Arabs that live in this place called Gerbal, but certainly that's to the southeast of the kingdom of Judah. The Ammonites, which are kind of off to the east by northeast of Judah, are also now paying tribute to Uzziah. And it is also said that his fame spread as far as the entrance of Eden. So considering these phrases to be like hyperlinks, we are told the same thing happened during the time of David. He subdues all of these areas, and they will in some way pay a measure of tribute. He doesn't do this impressively, but he does it to make sure that they understand that he is the regional power in charge, and that it seems to be working in favor of spreading the blessing that was supposed to come from Abraham to the nations, so that Israel and Abraham's people will bless all the families of the earth. And of course, it is also said of Solomon that he has influence and territory that reaches all the way down to the entrance of Egypt. So again, baking some of the David and Solomon flavor into the cake that is Uzziah's tenure as king. We even get some hints of Abraham here, because as we work through this passage, we see that he builds not only towers in the desert, but he digs many wells, which was something the patriarchs were known widely for, as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are moving all over the place. Many times it is said that they are building or digging wells, and sometimes even have some skirmishes with their neighbors because of the contestation as to who this well belongs to, right? But that's improving the land, which of course is something Uzziah is doing. And then we're also told that he is a lover of the soil. He had farmers and vine dressers in the hills and fertile lands, which also, when you look at Solomon's time as king from the vantage point of the book of Ecclesiastes, he beautifies not only Jerusalem and Judah, but much of Israel to become something of a new Eden, like the land flowing with milk and honey that Moses spoke to the Israelites as being a place that they would inherit when they leave Egypt. And at no point in Israel's kingdom was it ever as opulent and beautiful and as prosperous as it was during the time of Solomon's kingship. But this is kind of reaching back toward that goal in building up Judah to the point where their borders expand, as does their influence. And so he brings order to their army. He has a vastly expansive army of hundreds of thousands of people that he adeptly equips with shields, spears, helmets, armor, bows, and sling stones. He even makes these skillfully designed devices in Jerusalem that will shoot arrows and catapult stones down from the citadels to those who might come to lay siege against the city. And so his fame even spread, as it says in verse 15 of 2 Chronicles 26, to distant places beyond just the immediately surrounding kingdom. So again, some more Solomon-esque vibe kind of put in there for us to appreciate, all up until he winds up becoming strong, and then a measure of judgment is levied against him. But during his time, what we see here is that Jerusalem and Judah is on the rise. And inversely, Assyria, on the other hand, is reaching a period of stagnation. So to kind of give us a brief overview here of the kingdoms of Judah and then Israel. So just put some letters there for us. Way over here, and this is not drawn to scale, obviously, but we have the river Euphrates, the river Tigris. This is the Mesopotamian river valley. And here is the Assyrian kingdom that is now grown into a rather expansive empire and has dominated this area of the world. And some of these kings will be looking toward westward expansion through the kingdom of Aram and eventually to take over the kingdoms of the Hittites, the Israelites, Judah, and then press on down here to Egypt. But during the time that Uzziah is king, there is a period of Assyrian stagnation. They stop expanding, and many of the emperors, at least for a period of 5 emperors before this figure you see here next to Jotham, that being Tiglath-Pileser, is crowned. These 5 emperors will let many of their nobles have a lot more influence than their predecessors did, and that causes them to stop looking outwardly, but looking more so inwardly. And many of these nobles will make decisions that will do much to line their pockets, grow their own power base and influence, and continue to hedge them in as being the real power behind the throne. Which, if that's the case, if Jerusalem is going up and Assyria is going down, this inverse relationship does much to help benefit Judah as goes building peace and creating stability for that kingdom, which will last through that time of Uzziah's kingship. However, while his son Jotham has reigned as a co-regent for quite some time, while Uzziah had stricken with leprosy and was not really doing much to influence the affairs of the kingdom anymore, he will continue his father's aspirations as a good king to further fortify Judah. However, for reasons that are kind of unknown to us, in 2 Kings 15, verse 37, we are told that in the days of Jotham, the Lord began to send Aram's king Rezin and Pekah, who is the son of Remaliah. We're not told in this verse who he is, but he is known as the king of Israel at that time, to come against Judah. So Aram's king Rezin and Israel's king Pekah want to come and probably just through small military skirmishes begin to test the border defenses and the defense tactics and strategies of the kingdom of Judah. And of course, probably hearing word of all the defense mechanisms that Uzziah put in place to help guard and keep safe Jerusalem, just how effective those measures would be. So the skirmishes start in Jotham's day, but they will get progressively worse. And it would be during this time period that we end this period of Assyrian stagnation and dominance. Tiglath-Pileser III is crowned, and he has eyes fully bent on westward expansion and taking over the entirety of what is called the Levant, or the Near Eastern swath of land that is Israel, the kingdoms of Lebanon and Philistia, and then pressed down into Egypt. So eventually Jotham dies. His son Ahaz, who is one of Judah's most wicked kings, comes to power. And like Jeroboam and all the kings of Israel, he just runs right for the cliff and just jumps straight off the edge of that to plunge headlong into this cesspool of apostasy and idolatry. And because he does much to spiritually weaken Judah and Jerusalem, of course, the direct consequence would be that they will be weakened in just about every other area, certainly militarily and politically. So it will be during that time, if Aram and Israel began attacking and testing the perimeter and defenses of Judah during the time of Jotham, it will only get worse. And we are told in 2 Chronicles 28, verses 5 through 8, beginning in verse 5, that God handed Ahaz over to the king of Aram, who attacked him, took many captives to Damascus. Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, will do the same, taking 120,000 captives from Judah in one day, all brave warriors and valiant men, captive into his kingdom. The king's son, that being Ahaz, will actually wind up dying at the hand of a fellow Israelite. And then in verse 8 of that passage, it says, then the Israelites took 200,000 captives from their brothers, women, sons, daughters, and they also took a great deal of plunder from them and brought it to Samaria. So during this time, because it seems like the punches just keep on coming, Ahaz develops this crafty plan. He wants to get the big bully in the backyard here, that being Assyria, to come over here with their big stick and to get Aram and Israel off his back. However, it doesn't quite play out for him. And before we get the answer of what the king of Assyria will say, we are told the punches will come from other directions, because the Edomites will come and attack and they'll take captives. The Philistines will also come and attack and seize cities over here on the western border, and they will colonize these areas, and they too will take captives. So Philistia is attacking, Edom is attacking, and Judah as a kingdom has basically become a punching bag, and all because of the fact that Ahaz has led Judah into egregious apostasy, and the people are perpetually sinning against the Lord. So now to the answer of what King Tiglath-Pileser has to say to Ahaz, and in 2 Chronicles 28 verses 20 through 21, it says, "Then King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came against Ahaz. He oppressed him, and he did not give him support. Although Ahaz had plundered the Lord's temple, emptied the treasuries, including his own treasuries of his palace, and even took money from the nobles of the kingdom of Judah, and gave all of that to the king of Assyria as plunder for him, to buy him off and help him get these other enemies that are attacking Judah off of Ahaz's back, it does not work, because that verse or passage ends in verse 21 by saying it did not help him. So Tiglath-Pileser seemingly is coming in to exert a measure of dominance in the land to make sure not only does everybody else know that he has the power and the wherewithal and the resolve to conquer all of their kingdoms, including Egypt, even though they're not brought into this mix yet, but he wants to start at the heart of it all with Judah and give or use them as a message to everyone else to say, I run things here now. What ultimately is going to wind up happening is that Ahaz is going to be the last and final king descended from David, who rules over a sovereign and independent kingdom of Judah. Because from this point on, Ahaz is going to be paying heavy tributary offerings over to the king of Assyria, and they will continue to exert their measure of dominance over the kingdom of Judah throughout the time of Hezekiah, all the way down until eventually they are conquered by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians will continue to do the same thing, keeping the king they want in charge, which will happen after Josiah winds up dying, and then the king who is postured in his place after him, which was put there by the king of Egypt. But of course, Egypt is conquered by Babylon, and when that happens, of course, Nebuchadnezzar wants it known that he will allow whoever he chooses to rule on the throne in Judah. And of course, that leads to a few extra skirmishes of rebellion until eventually Babylon conquers. Now, in this story of Ahaz, there's a nice little synchronization point in Isaiah 7, and that chapter may sound familiar to you because it's from that chapter that we actually get the verse that is familiar to many of us around Christmas time, especially Isaiah 7:14, behold, the sign, the virgin shall conceive, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. But that is built against or placed there against the backdrop that is built in for us of Ahaz seeking for some measure of reprieve, but Isaiah saying, this is going to come from the Lord. You have to only ask, and he will give you a sign to assure you that he will fight for his people, but Ahaz doesn't want to do that. That's a lesson for a different time, but nonetheless, just to show we have some synchronization going on here. Then Hezekiah comes to the throne, and he is a largely good king. He works to try to spiritually revive Judah, starting with repairing the temple and then unifying everybody around the observance of Passover to get them to bring an end to their idolatrous practices. And he leads by example, by tearing down the high places and so forth. However, he is a vassal king ruling under the sovereignty and suzerainty. No, that's a hefty word, but that means a king who has conquered another kingdom, but allows the local governing mechanism of a king to continue on as far as a local being on the throne, as long as they recognize they are subservient to whoever this emperor is that rules over them. So now Sennacherib is the king of Assyria, and during Hezekiah's time as king, he eventually starts to reach for the golden prize of gaining back Judah's independence and sovereignty away from Assyria as a separate kingdom that the sons of David will rule over. However, It will not work out in his favor, and Sennacherib will actually come to answer that measure of rebellion by conquering all the fortified cities in Judah, and then, of course, come knocking on Jerusalem's door as the last and final stronghold. And of course, those stories are mentioned to us in 2 Kings 20, and that's the beginning for us of Isaiah chapter 39. But before we get to the moment where Hezekiah actually goes to the Lord in the temple and lays out before the Lord the letter that is written regarding the intentions of the king of Assyria, he actually attempts to try to garner an alliance with Egypt. And that is given to us in places like Isaiah 28 and chapter 30, which we'll explore in the future. It's called in one place a covenant of death, or a covenant with death, because Egypt is not going to do anything at all. They are powerless, too weak to be able to help the kingdom of Judah against the domineering force of Assyria that the Lord is actually backing up. And in chapter 30, it is spelled out explicitly by Isaiah that this covenant and this tactic will not work, will ultimately fail. So again, this is what's kind of going on in the backdrop that helps us appreciate, as we move through the Isaiah scroll, much of what we will see baked into Isaiah's oracles. So having said that, let's appreciate something of the pattern of compilation. Now, what I mean by that, some things that we need to understand here with respect to how books of the Bible are put together, and the process is not the same for all of them. But Isaiah, if you were ever imagining that he was preaching a sermon and writing those words that he is saying down simultaneously, then you have a completely false view of how these words that Isaiah preached were ever preserved. We're not told exactly how they are, but we are told in chapter 8 that, as was the case for guys like Elisha and even Samuel, they had disciples that may in some cases also be more minor prophets that worked to serve these men and write down the things that they said. Think of Jeremiah and the scribe Baruch, who penned much of what Jeremiah would have to say, and even reconstruct those messages after Jehoiachin decided to burn the books or the messages of Jeremiah that were sent to him for him to read. All that to say that during the time of these prophets, much of what they will say is largely unpopular. It's not appreciated by the aristocracy, and it will not be until after they die, and many of these signs that they spoke of will come to pass, and they recognize that indeed these men were faithful messengers of the Lord, and it just so happens that God was working in the lives and through the efforts of their disciples and servants to preserve their messages, that then the process of compiling them will begin. But in compiling them, there is an order to it. And that order does not have to reflect a chronological sequencing of the beginning of their sermons all the way to the very end. Think of it this way. If I gave any of you the specific task of sitting down over a 10-year period and taking all the sermons that Bart has preached and categorize them into the categories of sermons that come directly from the books of Moses, sermons that come from the books of the prophets, sermons that come from the New Testament, that would be one measure of, or one rubric of being able to categorize these sermons starting from beginning to end. But that would not reflect the order in which he preached them, right? Because there might be one sermon in year one that came from Torah and another sermon that came from Revelation also preached in year one, but that sermon's going to be put in this totally different stack. So the way that those sermons are arranged or compiled reflects the underlying structure that I gave you, which was categorizing them in this way. And we could shuffle those categories and create new ones that would totally mess up and rejumble how those sermons would be categorized. What I'm ultimately driving at here is that the compilation of this book is orchestrated in such a way that the sermons preached whenever they were during the time of Isaiah's tenure as prophet are now sequenced in such a way that it gives us an overall picture of the thematic thrust of the book, which we are going to take one chunk at a time, week in and week out. Because one interesting thing about this book is, whereas all the other books, compare it to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, as goes major prophets, and we have their calling as a prophet given to us in chapter 1, but we don't have that in Isaiah's book. Why is that? Why is it that it's in the 6th chapter we get his calling? And better yet, during Uzziah's time as king, when Isaiah is called, they have experienced a period of prosperity. Assyria has been kind of weakened for a period of time, and they are not exerting their influence on this side of the world, or maybe I should say this side of the Jordan. They really don't have too much to worry about. with respect to the geopolitical climate that they live in and whether or not any of these people are existential threats to them. So when we start with the first chapter of Isaiah and look at the condemnatory words he gives, that really wouldn't make a lot of sense or fit very neatly into the periods of Uzziah or probably even Jotham's kingships. Rather, that would certainly make a lot more sense in the apostasy or era of apostasy of Ahaz, or it wouldn't fit really well with Hezekiah either, right? But certainly during the period of Ahaz's time as king. And so why then do we not have a sequential chronological arrangement of his sermons? That would be part of the reason why. All right. So anyway, this would be one way of seeing it. And I hope what you appreciate here is that the hollowed out box underneath Judah is placed on trial, which says Isaiah chapter 1, verses 2 through 15, leads down to the second part of the chapter. But then when we transition over to the blue boxes, what you have here is chapter 2's opening statements, verses 1 through 4, that are paralleled with the concept of Jerusalem being cleansed and Jerusalem becoming the center of the world. Following the arrows, I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, then perhaps another way of viewing it would be through this lens, which is something of a chiastic structure here. And if you don't know what a chiasm is, I'll just have to adjure you to go and look that up on your own. And then after that, I think you'll appreciate better how this is compiled here. So for the sake of time, moving forward, let's start to dive into this. So I'm saying that we are prefacing Isaiah's message to Judah from that particular lens that I just introduced you to, and that is how these messages are compiled here, okay? So first and foremost, what we have here is him beginning in chapter 1, verse 2, "Listen, heavens, and pay attention, earth, for the Lord has spoken." And this is a formula that in large part, let me see if I can move my camera here so that way I can let you see the rest of that verse. There we go. My apologies. That in large part is representing the opening remarks of a legal case being made by the prophet who is the spokesman for the Lord against a particular audience that God wants this message levied against. And almost always, it's the very covenant people of God, Abraham's descendants. We find very similar messages being given by Isaiah's contemporaries, Hosea and Micah. When in Hosea 4:1, he says, "Hear the word of the Lord," but now it's not the heavens and the earth, it's the people of Israel, because the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land. But Micah kind of blends the two together when he says in chapter 6, "Listen to the Lord's lawsuit, you mountains, because the Lord has a case against his people." One thing that we need to remember is that the prophet has a very unique role to play in Israel. And even back in the time of Moses, when he's serving as prophet, works in the events and context of chapter 32, after the people have committed this measure of idolatry and apostasy against the Lord, violating the covenant and just breaking it to bits. He goes up Mount Sinai and he begins to plead as an intermediate for the people unto the Lord, not on the basis of the covenant that they violated, but on the basis of the promises that God has already made to their patriarchal ancestors, that God would remain faithful to that promise. So working as a legal adjudicator in that manner, that will set a legacy and precedent for many other prophets that will follow after him to do the same thing. When Elijah goes to Mount Sinai and he says to the Lord, when the Lord says, "State your purpose here, Elijah," he says, "I alone remain of the prophets, and the people have rebelled against you by killing your prophets, tearing down your altars, and ultimately violating your covenant," right? That's all legal language to express the fact that the reason why he's here is to prosecute these people in something of a court of law, asking that the Lord bring judgment upon them without necessarily having to say those words. All that to say that when we get to the very next half of this verse, we see the same thing, because as he finishes up verse 2, he gives the reason for why this case is being made by the Lord against his people. As the Lord says, I have raised children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. And we are reminded here that the reason why they are recorded as children is because God is the one who stated through Moses, as he was about to go and share this message with Pharaoh, Moses needed to understand that God accords Israel as his firstborn son. And there are several other places, as you see, like Deuteronomy 32, that reflect the idea of this relationship, which in places like Hosea is postured as that of a wife to husband, as goes Israel's relationship to God. But in other places, it's reflected in this son to father way. And so when Isaiah is stating the premise of the case, it's that these children have rebelled, and based off the words of the law in Torah, rebellious children who refuse to submit to their parents' authority can ultimately be consigned to death. And so, in a measure, that is exactly what these people can expect in hearing these words from Isaiah. But that could very well be the end result of what Isaiah is going to wind up speaking to them. And then he embellishes upon this. Now, what we also need to appreciate is if you're looking at your study Bible right now, at the words of Isaiah, much of what you will have in Isaiah will be stanzified, okay? What I mean is verse 1 is going to be written across the page like that, but then after you get past verse 1 and he actually starts into the oracles of what he will say, it is indented from the sides of the page past the standard margins and written more toward the center as if it's a song or a poem. And that's exactly what it is. It is poetic in nature, which means there's going to be quite a bit of figurative language that does not need to be stretched to be considered literal in every context. And that will, of course, be incorporated into other passages that we'll talk about shortly. But another thing that we also appreciate with this is that there is a device within Hebrew poetry known as parallelism, in which the first line will often state a premise, and the second line will often repeat it, but use different words and do so with expansive language to help us better understand what the qualification of the first statement was. So the first statement is, I have raised children, brought them up, they've rebelled against me. Verse 4 speaks to how they have rebelled, much in the way Elijah said, I alone remain of the prophets. And then he goes on to speak about, while this isn't a poem, why this is the case that God needs to prosecute because of the examples he gives. Isaiah is giving these examples of they abandoning the Lord, despising the Holy One of Israel, and turning their backs on him. And these words are borrowing language from words that Moses has already used in places like Deuteronomy 29, when he is speaking about the judgment that will befall Israel, should they ever abandon the Lord and the covenant. And God judges them by laying waste to the land, driving them out of there. And then the rubble and ash heap of what is left will be what the people gawk at. The nations will gawk at and wonder why this happened. And it will be said, because the Lord has done this, and this intense outburst of anger was levied against them because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord. Or a place like Numbers chapter 20, where they ultimately wind up rejecting the Exodus and choose not to go into the land, but instead elect a new leader who will take them back to Egypt because they have despised the Lord, despised the inheritance he wants to give them. So using a word like this in despising the Holy One would potentially bring that story back to the remembrance of these Israelites listening to the story or the message that Isaiah is giving them to understand you are like that previous generation of your ancestors who rebelled against the Lord in the wilderness and all died in exile. Much of what Isaiah will have to say in the oracles that are part of the future of this scroll that we have yet to cover will have a lot to do with this theme of exile, okay? So now moving on to the rest of verses 2 through 15, as we see Judah is firmly on trial here. We have some paralleling of images here, and what I have for you on the left side of the screen is meant to be paralleled with what you see on the right side of the screen. Okay, so verses 5 and 6, the whole head is hurt, the whole heart is sick, from the sole of the foot even to the head, not a single spot is uninjured. This is a rather all-encompassing picture when you consider the idea of head down to feet, heart included. Nothing remains unaffected by the actions of Judah and their kingdom. But now he parallels this over in verse 7 by giving a second all-encompassing picture when he says, your land is desolate, your cities are burnt down, foreigners devour your fields right in front of you. a desolation, like a place demolished by foreigners. So if we consider the idea that all of the land is included, and the two particular areas where all Israelite life is conducted, either the cities or in the open fields, and both of them have been completely laid waste or devoured, burnt, desolated, if you will. I'm not sure why I said burnt. Please excuse that. Desolated. We are seeing in some ways how this parallels this picture over here, because if the cities and the fields are completely decimated, that would mean all of this is affected as much as the entirety of this picture of Judah as a body is encompassed with disease. He will go on to speak about in verse 6, again, this goes back to the picture of the body, that it is covered in wounds, welts, festering sores. It's not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with oil, which, of course, if those wounds are not addressed with the medicinal knowledge and means of their day, it leaves them open and all the more vulnerable to the elements. And certainly, while they did not know this at the time, but we do from our vantage point, bacterial infections that can lead to things like gangrene and whatnot, and the loss of limb or even life. It creates a picture of very bad vulnerability on the part of the kingdom of Judah. They are not in a place of health. They are in a place of, compromise, as goes the health and status of the body itself, to the point where it's teetering on collapse. Which, if we parallel that with verse 8, consider this: daughter Zion is abandoned, like a shelter in a vineyard, a shack in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. So a besieged city technically isn't abandoned, because if the people are still in the city, the siege is ongoing. If the people have left the city, then what exactly is the city being laid siege to for? It is to indeed subdue the people and to destroy the city and take the people off into slavery as spoils of war. So that too is a picture then of vulnerability. All that to simply say that what we're appreciating here, as goes Isaiah's message, is that not all is well. Now, it could be that maybe he is preaching this sermon in the time of Uzziah's kingship, and that what everybody is assuming that things are well, Isaiah is actually pointing out that spiritually speaking, things aren't so well. However, considering the very positive picture that the writer of Chronicles is giving us, and remember, that work is constructed after the Babylonian exile is over with and people have started migrating back to the territory of Israel and resettling Jerusalem and so forth, that for that positive picture to be given like that, then it would suggest that if he was a good king for much of his time as king until he becomes strong and chooses to rebel against the Lord, that he was leading the people in a way that was spiritually lucrative for them. So again, it doesn't really seem to fit that particular time period, but it would at a time when Ahaz is king and all the people are chasing after the various idols that Ahaz has now made it possible for them to worship with all the various altars that he has constructed, right? Anyway, he goes on in verse 9 to say, if the Lord of armies had not left us a few survivors, then we would be like Sodom. We would resemble Gomorrah. He uses that literary technique or device there to then continue his message by saying in verse 10, which you see in the lower left corner of the screen, so then hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. Just in case it's confusing, obviously he's not talking to these kingdoms because they have long since been extinct. Centuries ago, in the time of Abraham, were those kingdoms destroyed by brimstone and fire coming down out of heaven. But we will also recall in verse 4 of chapter 1 of Isaiah's scroll that he is first and foremost from chapter or verse 1. These are the visions concerning Judah and Jerusalem. But then as he begins to address them, he calls them in verse 4 a sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity, a brood of evildoers, like a brood of snakes, depraved children. So if this is the subject of those who he is referring to, now in verse 10, calling them rulers of Sodom, people of Gomorrah, that is meant to call into mind all of the egregious things that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were doing. Obviously, the homosexual practices, but certainly the other things that Ezekiel draws our attention to in his oracles. speaking to their lack of hospitality and their just outright rebellion against the Lord. And they are to remember the measure of justice that God brought against them, and that if God is according them like people of Sodom and Gomorrah, they are teetering very dangerously close to this kind of measure of justice being brought on them as well. So what I hope you're beginning to see here are some of these contextual clues that give us, first and foremost, a picture of what the health of the nation is, spiritually speaking, and that things are not very good at all. And other words are given to us here to speak of how God is according these people that live in this kingdom of Judah that is supposed to be ruled over by a son of David who is supposed to act like David, but obviously isn't, in such a way that he now considers them to be almost a foregone afterthought and a lost cause, like the kingdoms of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moving on to verse 11, he asks the question, what are all your sacrifices to me, asks the Lord. Now, as you move on the left side of this column, I'm breaking this down into all the various things that Isaiah will say, as goes qualifying what he means by sacrifices in various places in Torah where we are seeing these sacrifices come to us from. First and foremost, burnt offerings, which comes from the chapters 1 and 6 of Leviticus. Remember, the burnt offering, as the olah, which is the Hebrew word for burnt offering, is the ascension offering, in which the animal that is being laid on the altar, these are just stones, and this is the big bloody mass there. Forgive me, I can't make that look like an animal. That is now being chemically transformed into ash while its smoke is rising up into heaven, was the animal that the offerer brought to the priest, laid their hands on the head of the animal, and with that, identifying with the animal's essence, the animal and the person essentially become one. And by virtue of that, the animal is the vicarious atoning substitute for the offerer, taking the offerer's place on the altar, but not dying to expunge sin, but through the process of the body of the animal being transformed, then the offerer or worshiper is ascending with the offering up into the peak of the summit of the Lord's cosmic mountain, where his temple dwells. There's so many passages of scripture to allude to with that. I would adjure you back to our Torah intensive, and especially the context of the book of Leviticus, to better understand that. But he is saying he finds no pleasure in this. God does not want them attempting to try to ascend to his cosmic mountain, because they are not welcome. Now, the question then would be, why is that? We'll get to that in a minute. We drill down through the rest of these, as goes rams and the prospect of them violating the holy things of the Lord. And this is supposed to be a measure of restitution. But again, God finds no pleasing effort in that, nor does he accord that as being satisfactory any longer. Or even the things like the fat of well-fed cattle. He doesn't want anything to do with that, which is his assigned portion. We are told in Leviticus 3 and 4 that fat belongs to God, and that no one, not even the priests, can eat from the fat. But he is saying, in essence, keep that. The blood of bulls, which of course is used for sin offerings, that is meant to be taken beyond the curtain that separates the tabernacle from the outer court. And if people such as leaders or priests sin, and they need to have that sin that is unintentional, but nonetheless needs to be atoned for, then the offering made on the altar, the blood itself is collected from it. And this is the very first offering mentioned in Leviticus, in which blood is collected for this purpose. And that is to take it beyond the first curtain and to anoint the horns of the altar of incense, to purify it, so that the people continue to have an open conduit to be able to pray unto the Lord, and for him to appreciate and honor the sweet smelling savor of that incense and perfume rising to the summit of his cosmic mountain, where he dwells in his temple, and he will then incline his ear to their prayers. He is saying he will not allow for that anymore, if that be the case. Lambs and male goats, the same thing with respect to sin offerings or various other sacrifices, as goes restitution. New moons and Sabbaths, when they are supposed to come and celebrate the fact that a new month begins or a new week begins. They are to sacrifice their autonomy to God, and they are to recognize he is king of the cosmos, and they are willing to come and fellowship with him, or even spread out their hands in prayer, which doesn't have a direct link perhaps to Torah, but I think it does to what Solomon was saying in 1 Kings 8, when he was actually dedicating the temple that replaces the tabernacle, saying, Lord, when your people have committed sin against you, even if you've taken them away from this land to a different place, but yet they turn their face to this house and they raise their hands to you and lift their voices unto this house, will you hear from heaven and answer their prayers, forgive their sins? But here he is saying, even when you spread your hands out to me, what is this to me? The ceaseless trampling of my courts. Who told you to come in here? And if this is going on in the time of Ahaz, when military enemies are threatening them on all sides, but they're coming to the Lord to basically use him as something of a talisman, like they did in the days of Eli and the period of the judges and so forth, when the Philistines were the existential threat at the time. He is saying, I want no part of this. And they should have learned from that lesson that God, of course, will not allow such a thing to go unchecked and unpunished. So for him to say that he does not want to accord their prayers any longer is to simply say, look, all of this is folly. None of this is useful for either you or me. And if that's the case, if this whole cultic system was set in place for them to be able to approach God, to be accepted by God, and for them to fellowship with God and experience a measure of standing in his presence as much as they possibly can, considering the limitations of his holiness and their sinfulness, then if he's invited them into his presence, why then is he turning them away? If something is missing, what could that be? And I would think, pulling from the words of Moses, the fact that he told them before they enter into the land, you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, every fiber of your being, basically. That has to be coupled with those sacrifices, or else it's meaningless. If faith is not coupled with the circumcision they bear in their flesh, then they are not children of Abraham. Remember what Samuel said in the second time he dressed Saul down, when he told him, as he comes to inspect whether or not Saul was faithful to the mission given to him, and instead he preserves the king of the Amalekites and all of these animals that Saul wants to sacrifice to the Lord. He says, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention to God is better to him than what is the best portion of the animal, and solely belongs to him as his portion of the sacrifice. He wants your obedience and your heart more than the blood and fat of animals. That obviously is something that the people of Judah are keeping from him. And part of the reason why God is bringing this measure of legal charge against them and trying them in this court setting. Now, moving down through the rest of this chapter, verses 16 to 31. But even though this is the sad case of Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah, God is not going to leave it like this. Ultimately, he is forecasting that Jerusalem will be cleansed. Notice Isaiah says in verse 16, which is parallel with the thoughts of verse 18, wash yourselves, cleanse yourselves, remove your evil deeds from my sight. However, it's important for us to understand that as we go to verse 18, though your sins are scarlet, they will be as white as snow. They are crimson red, they will be like wool. Many times we hear that verse used evangelically in a sermon that is meant to reach across to sinners, to say, for those who are yet to become disciples of Christ, though they are sinners and outside of relationship with God, yet because of what Christ has done, they can have their sins, in essence, that are like scarlet, cleansed to become white like snow. Though they are red, they will become white like wool. While that is true, that is a Christian reading of what is understood to be Isaiah's words. What I mean by that is that is certainly not what these original hearers would have thought. They're not looking forward to Messiah. And so therefore we have to pause before we jump to Messiah and think, what were the original hearers to understand of this? If this is paralleling verse 16, then the understanding would be, when they wash themselves, their sins that were like scarlet will now become white like snow. Cleansing themselves, to again qualify the thought even further, will help them get the red off their ledger so that now they will be white like wool. The understanding then is not anti-Christian in the sense that it is a works-based salvation. We should not think of it like that. But the understanding is that a demand is being placed on them, which ultimately we will realize, as goes the larger meta-narrative of Scripture, is really not something anyone can do. We are not capable of cleansing ourselves. This points all the more toward the need of what Isaiah will say way on down the line in other chapters, especially the servant songs, when he speaks about Israel's ineptitude and unwillingness to do any of these things, to wash or cleanse themselves, remove evil from the presence of the Lord so that their sins can be atoned for and cleansed. And because of this, God recognizes the very thing that Moses said would have to happen. He needs to circumcise their hearts. He will send a faithful servant who will indeed bear out the legacy of what Israel was always supposed to do, fulfill their mandate, and bridge the gap so that the nations too can also be incorporated into God's covenant family, which brings about the very promise that God said would happen through Abraham and his seed after him. But here's why it's all the more important for us to appreciate the words of Torah. Also, I meant to tell you back here, the reason why I wanted to bring all of this up to our purview is because you will almost never hear any of these prophets ever say, as it was said from the mouth of Moses, the Lord's servant, and then directly quote from one of the books of Torah. What they do is bake in all of these different phrases and hyperlinks that show you they are pulling directly from Torah, which is the very basis of the covenant, or I should say, the very basis of the legal charges that God is bringing against Judah. The basis on which he is trying them is the fact that they agreed to enter into a covenant with him, and every generation is responsible for being obedient to the covenant, but they have violated the covenant, and so thereby God has all legal right to enact the curses that covenant would spell out should they rebel and attempt to throw off the covenant. So Isaiah is in every way leaning very heavily upon the words of Moses that are influencing much of his thought and many of his words that he is bringing out to the people. It's important for us to be familiar with these phrases from Leviticus and to know our Leviticus well, because wash yourselves and cleanse yourselves, these are priestly terms. We should think then of the olah, or burnt offering, from Leviticus 1. If you go back and just read that short chapter, it is not the priest who is mangling the animal. The person brings the animal to the priest, and the priest is watching and supervising. But the priest is the one who will take the parts of the animal that are cut apart by the offerer and arrange them on the altar. The priest can approach the altar, can touch the altar, because he's consecrated for that task. The offerer cannot do that. But the offerer is the one slitting the throat of the animal, cutting open their abdomen, disemboweling the animal, washing out the carcass to get rid of all the gunk, grit, and grime, to make the animal acceptable as an offering. So the idea is washing yourselves is to make you an acceptable sacrificial offering before the Lord, because again, that is to identify with the animal and become one with the animal and its essence, as the animal will take the place of the offerer and ascend unto the Lord at the top of his cosmic mountain, right? Cleansing yourselves, again, same thing, but it bears out a larger context with respect to all these other ceremonial laws that are going to be given for us in very specific detail in Leviticus, that if you touch a dead body, if you give birth to a child, if you've passed the period of your menstrual cycle but you're still bleeding, all of these things that taint you with death and ritual impurity have to be met with some measure of prescriptive remedy, either cleansing of body, clothes, or both, maybe even sacrifice, right? In some cases, like that of mold and mildew, maybe even utensils have to be cleansed, but they cannot be used again, and the person cannot approach the Lord until these measures have been taken, again, to make them acceptable, right? Bridging down to verse 17, learn to do what is good, pursue justice. This is how they will ultimately come to remove the evil from the Lord's sight, correct the oppressor, defend the rights of the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Again, all of this coming directly from the words of Moses, as that is what the judges of the land were adjured to do, to make sure they do not allow their judgments to be perverted by taking bribes. They are not to exploit the vulnerability of the weak ones, especially widows and orphans, but they are to make sure that they not necessarily expedite their cases, but give them as much legal weight and grounding as anyone else's case would deserve, and not take into consideration the fact that they are disadvantaged like this, but to give them what justice requires and not pervert justice by favoring the one who is pressing a case against this person to take away from them land or inheritance or whatever the case might be. However, this is not the picture that we find. In fact, we'll learn from this as we move through verses 19 onward. He says, this is the words of Isaiah, if you are willing and obedient, you will eat the good things of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you will be devoured by the sword. This comes directly from what Moses will say in one of the 2 chapters that spell out the curses of what will happen if they fail to be obedient to the covenant. He tells them in Leviticus 26, if you follow my statutes and carefully observe my commands, right there you go, virtually the same construct that Isaiah gives, then I will give you rain at the right time, and the land will yield its produce. You will eat the good things of the land. But he goes on to say further in the chapter, if you do not obey me and observe these commands, what Isaiah says, refuse and rebel, then I will bring a sword against you and execute the vengeance of the covenant. Isaiah says, you will be devoured by the sword. So Moses has already warned what would be the legal measures the Lord would take. And here Isaiah is saying that recourse is very much in play still. And again, you are much closer to seeing that becoming your reality than it was in the days of Moses. Continuing on with this thought, we see in verse 21, almost in a satirical and sarcastic way, he speaks of Jerusalem as the faithful town, because he goes on to describe her as an adulteress. And ultimately, this will become a place that is filled with murderers. So considering the idea that when Israel entered into covenant union with God on a marital construct in Exodus chapter 24. So there's that scene rehashed for us in which Moses and the people at the base of Mount Sinai, he reads to them the words of the covenant. The people gleefully exclaim, everything you have said that the Lord has said through you, we will do. Excellent. So Moses sacrifices an animal and he sprinkles them with the blood, the very medium the words are written on, to bind them in covenant arrangement with the Lord, and ultimately to marry them to God. And then he's going to go up the mountain to share the good news with God that they have accepted the terms and they want to be married to you as your wife. And this is the very language that Isaiah is using. At the beginning of their marriage, like a virgin who has entered into a marital union with the husband that has chosen her, she is meant to be, or understood to be, chaste and has not compromised herself with other men that she has slept with before entering into marriage, and that she is making the covenant commitment to remain faithful and pure all the days of their marriage. However, they have not. They have compromised themselves. And in verse 23, we're beginning to understand, as this builds through that device of Hebrew parallelism, as we spoke about before, how they have become an adulteress. Because her rulers are rebels. They are the friends of thieves. So again, perverting justice. So they're compromising their position and station and influence over the people the way an adulteress would compromise herself in a marital relationship with her spouse. Like murderers. And God is ultimately saying in verse 24 and 5 that he will take vengeance against them. He will turn his hand against them as they have turned their hand against others. Much in the same way Cain turned his hand against Abel, compromising the sanctity of their relationship as brothers. He goes on in verse 21 to say, what an adulteress she has become. She was once full of justice. Righteousness once dwelt in her, but now, again, murderers. So, once full of justice, but now diluted, not so full of justice, which he parallels in verse 22 by saying, your silver has become dross to be discarded. Your beer is diluted with water. Once you drop just a few drops of water into wine, it's not going to taste quite as strong or succulent, depending upon if you like the taste of it, right? All that to say, the same can be said for beer. You would cheapen the quality of it by diluting it with water. So the quality of the essence of this once chaste virginal bride espoused to the Lord and entering into marital union with him has been diluted and compromised in the ways that Isaiah began to explain here. He'll go on to say in verse 25, so I will turn my hand against you, and I will burn away your dross completely. I will remove your impurities, bridging this thought to this one to say, this is how bad things are, but God is going to do something to fix that. However, that will require them to enter the crucible, to have the intense scrutiny of God's measure of justice brought on them, to allow them to arrive to this position of vulnerability where God can scrape away the dross and purify them. Right? In verse 23, he speaks of how they have perverted themselves by saying that their judges and rulers chase after bribes. They do not defend the rights of the fatherless. Remember here, he was telling them this is what they're supposed to do. But the reason why he's saying they're supposed to do that is because it's clear that they're not. The widows' cases never come before them. They won't even bother hearing them, certainly denying justice in every way. But then in verse 26, the prescriptive remedy through him burning off their dross, purifying them through what is yet to come for them, they will ultimately arrive at a place where God will restore their judges like they were at the beginning of their time, as this nation, a chaste virgin, espousing him, that started off on the right foot, and their adversaries, or I'm sorry, their advisors to what they were at the start as well, such that their integrity will no longer be compromised, but fully restored. And then after this measure of replenishment and renewal, this faithful town that's being made fun of here will indeed be called a faithful town yet again. And they, as a city that was once filled with righteousness, will once again be called the righteous city. So now we move into the context of chapters 2 and 4. Remember, chapter 4 is very brief, and many of the words that are being spoken there are paralleling the very thoughts that are being introduced to us in the beginning of chapter 2. So what we've understood so far is that Isaiah has broadcast to us Jerusalem and Judah are in very bad places. They are like a sick body that is devoid of any sign of health, that is teetering on the point of complete collapse and ultimately death, that as a land, they have become desolate because city and field are in no way left unaffected by the catastrophes that have come. And the question is asked, what is the point of beating you further? Because you are going to rebel either way. So now God has arrived at a place where he is stating what is going to be the inevitable outcome, that he is going to cleanse and renew them and the reasons why that must happen. But it is going to exact a very heavy toll. But the ultimate end outcome is what he starts chapter 2 with, and that is, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. This is one of those places where we start to dive into the apocalyptic sense of what Isaiah is trying to help us understand. By way of that, let me help you understand, first and foremost, biblically speaking, apocalypse does not mean end of the world. It just simply means unveiling, opening the curtains to see what's behind it. In fact, that Greek word apocalypsos, that actually is the word translated revelation in the book of Revelation, is speaking to that very thing when Jesus is showing the things that must soon take place, but ultimately unveiling his glory, who he is as the preeminent Son of God, ruling at the right hand of the Father right now as king over the cosmos, who is ultimately going to dispense justice in the day of the Lord. It's this thing that Isaiah is speaking about with this measure of apocalyptic unveiling here that is speaking about what must come in the last days, but he's not speaking about the end of the world. It's how things on earth will transition to the perpetual and unending dominion of the Lord over the earth, on the earth, as he comes to rule over mankind. Now, when he says in the last days, the mountain of the Lord, which we understand is Jerusalem, will be raised. Here's the thing, friends. Jerusalem is the place where the temple currently resides. I can't draw a temple for you in 2 seconds, so just take this for what it is. So just pillars, columns, nice fancy roof. But it sits on top of a high place, which is where the tabernacle was always situated on hills, because dotted throughout the Judean landscape are small hills, and some may actually be mountains and whatnot. Let me try to make that a little bit more like a hill, where people are building altars, as the patriarchs did, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in the various places they moved to. And of course, they wind up becoming high places that will continue to venerate Yahweh or become perverted sites of paganistic worship to other gods. And certainly in the time when Abraham is wandering through the land, there are already high places all over where people are worshiping the Canaanite gods of Baal and various other deities. And of course, there they erect Asherah poles or build what they call sacred trees and so forth. What Isaiah is saying is that in the last days, all of these will cease to be anything, not because they will ultimately be destroyed, and I'm not arguing that they won't, but because in the last days, there will be no need for them anymore. And ultimately, the hill or mountain of the Lord will ascend to become the chief of all of these worship sites. And we'll explain why here in a second. But I need to dispel the idea, as some would capture, the notion that somehow through the events of the book of Revelation, that the world is going to be topographically terraformed in such a way that through cataclysmic changes that will come by virtue of tectonic plate shifting and earthquakes and stars hitting the earth's surface, that the city of Jerusalem itself is going to be elevated to become the highest mountain peak in the world, taller than Mount Everest, if such a thing is still left, right? That is not what we are to appreciate here. The understanding is exactly as I explained here, compared to all the other sacred sites that are given throughout the landscape of Israel, Jerusalem will finally take its place as the most important one. And he'll go on to qualify this by saying in verses 2 and 3 that all nations will stream to it, and many people will come to say, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways so that we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So what I'm saying here is the picture that we get in the beginning of Scripture, in the Genesis prologue, is that God raises dry land from the chaotic waters below, and on that he plants a garden space where he puts a tree and a man and a woman, and they will come to live together as image bearers who serve as king, queen, priests. And this, of course, this temple scenario here is the place where God and man meet. He gives them his wisdom, they bask in his glory, and they are going to share this with the rest of the world. And we get that from the picture of the river that comes from Eden, but then when it leaves the garden, branches out to become 4 other rivers that go toward the nations. In chapter 2 of Genesis, we're told that one of these flow around the land of Asher, which is resoundingly clearer in the days of Isaiah as being the very land or kingdom of Assyria. And of course, one of those rivers being the very Tigris River that flows right past them. And that the blessings of Eden will even flow someday to that particular people group. And Isaiah is going to pick up on that thought in Isaiah 19 when he speaks about the triumvirate of Assyria, Israel, and Egypt all being God's people, and the superhighway that connects all 3 of these kingdoms together over this vast swath of land that they all occupy. But what we have here is something of a reversal of the picture in Isaiah's words. Instead of rivers streaming from the mountain, instead people will be streaming up the mountain. The reverse flow fashion of these rivers that were coming down the cosmic mountain of the Lord, and now the people will be going up the cosmic mountain to the place where God's temple is, where God physically dwells, and they will say, come, let's go. Let's hear his words. And then instruction will come from Zion, from Jerusalem, and it will flow down as the people take this back to the places where they live. It's completing the picture of what was lost in the Genesis prologue. It's not telling us that someday a physical temple is going to be built again or any of those things. I would love to entertain your questions, but I realize we're limited to some extent. You can always find me offline if you have any questions about this. But this parallels quite nicely here with what's being said in chapter 4, that on that day, the branch of the Lord. Now notice the very terminology that's being given here. This will be qualified further in Isaiah 11 when he speaks about the stump that was Jesse's line. And then instead of a new David coming from the stump, there will be another son of Jesse, like a second David coming from that. And that person will be known as the branch. But there's a reason why the botanical term is more implicative than just the idea of resurrecting a dead family line. It's to say that we are crossing back into that botanical vision of the original garden temple where God and man first met, the concept of Eden blessing flowing from the temple that is carried over in the imagery of the tabernacle, which on the reliefs of the walls, certainly in the temple, you see this. There are cherubim, there are palm trees, there are vines and gourds, and all of that to reconstruct the idea that this is where God and man meet for the sacred purpose of not only worship, but for man to receive wisdom from the Lord and to bless the nations with it, which again was what Abraham was told his people would do. So this branch, on that day, the last days, this branch of the Lord will beautify the land and make it glorious. And the fruit of the land coming from this branch will be the pride and glory of Israel's survivors. So ultimately, in the last days, when this mountain of the Lord becomes the highest and most sacred of all worship sites, that the people will river up to it to hear from the Lord, receive his wisdom, and take it back with them from Zion, that this branch figure will ultimately be the one who, as a new tree of life, will be branching out to bring the fruit of Eden blessing to the nations. I know that's a terrible picture, but hopefully you get the idea. And to finish the thought here, then the Lord will create a cloud of smoke by day and glowing flame of fire by night over the entire site of Mount Zion and over its assemblies. So where does that take us back to? I would think it's obvious to you, and you hopefully are saying, this is the story of Israel's exodus from Egypt when he was leading them through the wilderness, as the people were dotting the landscape and following this pillar of fire by night or cloud by day. Sometimes these two things are intertwined to become one, as was the case of the parting of the Red Sea and the distinction between Israel and Egypt. All that to say, this is a picture of exile ending and Exodus beginning, and God leading the people. Where is he leading them? To the site of Mount Zion, where this place that is a manifestation of God's presence, we are told that the angel of the Lord actually occupied the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, leading them at the head of the procession, that he will be the one as an incarnate manifestation standing upon the mountain of the Lord, providing cover for the mountain and over its entire assemblies. There will be a canopy over all the glory, and there will be a shelter for shade from heat by day, refuge and shelter from storm and rain. Again, pictures that Isaiah is going to repackage for us at other points to speak about this Exodus movement that's coming in Israel's future, which he is hinting at now. That at the terminal end of what will happen as Israel is about to go headlong into judgment, that on the other end of that will come the age of Messiah. And with that, this whole arc is going to be exile followed by Exodus. And Messiah will be the one leading that Exodus. This Exodus will be such a one that doesn't just simply lead people out of captivity. It's going to completely change the landscape, at least in the figurative way that he begins to speak of it, that in desolate places where life does not flourish, when Messiah comes on the scene, life will flourish. He speaks of it in terms of streams popping out into the desert. And of course, flowers budding all over the place. Where there was no life, there was only death. But now life will ensue, because whereas Messiah leads his people back to this land, this is the idea, is that ultimately he is going to bring them to the summit of that mountain where they will once again reestablish proper worship with the Lord. And in our minds, we're a little short-sighted in thinking that Isaiah is speaking of the rebuilding of temple that will come in the days of Zechariah and Haggai, or thinking about the reestablishment of proper cultic worship from the words and law of Moses that is present during the time of Jesus. What Isaiah is speaking of is the very message that Jesus brings onto the scene with respect to the idea of new temple that is constructed of people, that is built off the foundation of him. But before we get to that point, let's understand how Isaiah is packaging this message for these people. They are to understand from this that this person known as the branch is going to resurrect Eden for them. That's going to come on the other side of what lay in the middle portion of chapter 2 and all of the context of chapter 3. And it is not all doom and gloom. It will be a moment in time in which Israel will enter into a period of never-ending prosperity when God rules over them, and he will lead them through a new phase of exile by measure of a new exodus to this place where he will be their ultimate refuge, as he says here, from the heat by day, shelter from both storm and rain. Now, you may have noticed here in the background here, there seems to be a faded out picture, and the reason why is because I postured this as something of an inclusio. You might ask, what in the world is that? So an inclusio is a poetic device. Most of the time it's in the Psalms, but it's in other places where we have poetry in the Bible, where one statement is given, and then several verses later, or maybe just a few verses later, another statement is given, but these are exactly the same, verbatim. And everything in between these two particular statements all pertain to the same overarching theme or idea. So that's the idea of an inclusio. So these two passages, as goes Jerusalem becoming the center of the world, the elevation of the Lord's mountain, and then, of course, Messiah beautifying Zion as a new Eden space, are the inclusio phrases that are meant to surround the portions of what is left of chapter 2 and all of chapter 3. So the rest of chapter 2, we are to understand, is the impending day of Yahweh. What will have to happen in order for the Lord to make Jerusalem what it is intended to become, right? And in this, we'll see the context of chapter 3 speaks of Judah's leaders being on trial, which are exclusively men, but the women do not escape this because they have had a part to play in this as well. A verse to kind of sum up the intention of all of this is that Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen because they have spoken and acted against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. How have the leaders done this? They have attempted by using means outside of just simply inquiring of the Lord through the prescribed means of the high priest and the Urim and Thummim, or the Lord's spokesman, i.e. prophets. But they are using occultic, not cultic. You've heard me use the word cultic, but this is occultic knowledge. That's hidden knowledge. By using practices such as divination that they've learned from the East, fortune tellers like those amongst the Philistines, and through the observance of worship of worthless idols, which are nothing more than the works of their hands that their fingers have made. And by virtue of this, by trying to gain hidden knowledge that God will readily make known if he chooses to through proper venues such as prophets or Urim and Thummim, if he wants to make his will known and discernible that way. He will do it in one of those two prescribed means. But to try to cut open an animal and take out the liver and dice it up to see what is the pattern of the veins running through it, and then extrapolating from that as an omen, what is the will of the gods, or in this case, Yahweh, or using various other means of divination to find out, is God for them? Is he against them? What is he up to? And how can we either counter that or get in line with that? By virtue of that, as Paul makes the case in Romans 1, humanity is greatly degraded and shamed by virtue of that, because the practice of observing worship of these worthless idols often causes the degradation of humanity by subjugating humans to be cultic prostitutes. And of course, with that, a measure of homosexuality being observed. After all, they're in the land of Israel, but Moses told them when he is talking about homosexuality in Torah, don't do this, because these are the abominable and detestable practices the people in the land are already doing. Hence the reason why God is choosing to kick them out, using you to do that. If you do that, then God is going to use others like you to kick you out of the land, right? So humanity is greatly degraded and shamed by virtue of this, as he says, brought low, humbled. And of course, we go further over into chapter 3, where he says, then the Lord is about to remove from Jerusalem every measure of security that they have tried to gain for themselves, which this too is to be seen as a measure of security. If they can understand what God is doing without him having to reveal it so that they can use that to their advantage, that of course provides security, but God is going to strip them of any and all security. But he expounds upon this further by saying other measures of security, such as bread and water, their warriors, their judges, even the prophets, but not the prophets who are speaking for the Lord, rather false prophets. We have copious examples of those in scripture and other stories. Again, fortune tellers who are providing this measure of security, elders, commanders of 50s, dignitaries, counselors, cunning magicians, and people who even attempt to try to talk to the dead. Again, occultic practices, right? So then the women, they don't escape this. Daughters of Zion, they have acted haughty. They have not dressed with a sense of modesty in their choice of select attire. Instead, they choose to adorn themselves with various other accoutrements mentioned over here in verses 18 through 23. But he speaks about the way they conduct themselves. They are seductive, using their eyes to try to lure men into nefarious and inappropriate relationships with them, prancing along, jingling their ankle bracelets, which would often signify the kind of woman that they are. And the Lord is going to degrade and shame them by putting scabs on the heads of these daughters and ultimately shave their foreheads. And on that day, the day of the Lord, he will strip away their finery, all of these things that they adorn themselves with, right? In such a way that it will ultimately cause them to feel the shame that he is speaking of. And before we get to how the Lord is going to remove this security from, or what security he's going to remove from them, he speaks about how on that day, again, day of Yahweh, he is going to come against them. And notice here, I've highlighted for you by embolding the words, all these against all, or against every. And I'll let you read those for what they are. But ultimately, to just simply signify that this is how God is going to bring them to a point of them being decimated and affected in every possible way that they can be, such that they will understand this was of his doing, and he did this to capture their attention, because he is not going to abandon them to a fate that they wholly deserve, but rather he is going to remain faithful to the covenant he made with them and do as Moses had said must be done. He is going to change them by circumcising their hearts. But before that can happen, they must be cleansed. And so part of what Isaiah has done in these opening oracles, which again are preached at some point way after the time that Isaiah has been called as a prophet, have been compiled and orchestrated as they are at the beginning of Isaiah's scroll to spell out as something of a preface, maybe a prologue, to what this oracle and this entire scroll is going to unpack for us. And that is Israel as a people, not just as a kingdom per se. Israel as a people have woefully walked away from the Lord in disobedience. And not only is God angry, and justly so, and is pressing a legal case against them to explain why he is justified in doing what is about to be done, but that in spite of the fact they have not loved him, he has still loved them. And that ultimately the covenant had little to do with how much they would love God, but how much he loved them in choosing them in the first place to be this vessel to influence the nations with. And so as we continue to move through this, that's part of what we are to appreciate. We're not quite done with these prefacing oracles, because we still have chapters 5 and 6, or I should say chapter 5 to get to or through before we get to chapter 6. So there will be a little bit more of this to build on next week, but then we'll move on after we get past chapter 6. So I hope that you have appreciated this and learned something from it. So again, I adjure you to please come and hang out with us on Wednesday if you can. So that way you can act with the class, interact with me in the class, ask questions as others are attempting to do so as well, so that we can all learn together. I appreciate your time.